I'd like to begin with a greeting of peace, Om Shanti, which means Om, I am, and that refers to the inner being, and Shanti means peace, and it's a very beautiful expression to keep coming back to again and again. And in a way, it sums up what is essential spirituality, to be able to know what is essential for my life, which means to know who I truly am, to know the inner being, the self. That's really such an important aspect of being able to live a life in which there's happiness and love. And so often we've moved so far away from the aspects of truth and love and joy in our lives. And so I'd like us to be able to explore some of those reasons why things are the way they are, but also maybe we can find some different perspectives to look at the same story. And once we've been able to look at the same thing from a different angle, then maybe we're going to find some solutions. For me, spirituality is maybe 3 things. Being able to connect with myself once more, which sounds a bit odd, but it's the reality. We're connected so much with the external persona, we forget about connecting with the inner being. And secondly, to be able to connect with the divine, the source, whatever I may know the source to be. But how do I connect and draw what I need within myself? And thirdly, on the basis of these 2 aspects, to use this inner capacity that's now being developed and to be able to use my inner potential in the best possible way in the work that I do in the world and the relationships that I have with others around me. When I'm in touch with myself as a spiritual being rather than my name, my physical form, my external identity, the profession that I have, my designation, etc., in that spiritual consciousness of being that being within, I'm in touch with my own conscience. My conscience is awake and alert and is able to give me guidance. And for most people today, it's very difficult to hear the very quiet voice of the conscience speak inside, maybe because they don't give it enough time. Because you need to let your mind become quiet, otherwise the mind is like the chattering monkey that's on and on and on. And of course, all the things that we're surrounded with, all our devices are adding to that non-stop flow of information. And there isn't a moment just to stop and be still and ask myself the question, should I not? And because we're missing out on that, then we get pulled into whatever becomes the social norm. And you can see how from a society generally that had morals and values, there was a downward slide to a society where maybe people didn't bother too much about morals, and maybe they knew what they were doing was wrong, but they still carried on doing it. So you get to the state of immorality. But then you get to a state of amorality, which is quite normal nowadays, where people will say, oh, don't even talk about morals anymore. So amorality, where morals don't have an influence on human life and policies and the way in which things are going. And so definitely the moral compass, the conscience, awakens through silence, through spirituality, knowing myself. And that's also the guideline that gives me the principles on which I work within my field of expertise, my profession, the policies we create. You see some of the debates that go on in the world, and there's a long list of them. And we're not really looking at the values that are innate to human beings. And so we're going totally against that in so many different situations. Maybe it's a question of building more and more casinos. Maybe it's the question of lowering the age of consent. Maybe it's the issue of racism maybe it's all sorts of things like this that we're having to deal with. But ethics and values are connected with the spirit within, and spirituality means exploring my own being within. And so yes, definitely spirituality allows the awakening of the conscience, the moral compass, and to allow ethics to come back into our lives and public life also. I can't remember that when I was young there was so much fear around. As a 9-year-old child, my mother would let me run to the corner shop in London, and she'd put a £1 note in my hand and give me a list of things to get, and I'd run, and the shopkeeper would give me a big smile and give me whatever it is was on that list, and then he'd make sure I was holding the change very tightly in my hand so that it didn't drop out, and I'd run back again. I cannot imagine a mother being able to say to a 9-year-old girl anymore, or a boy, doesn't matter, run down to the corner shop and get this for me. That little illustration just gives me an indication of how society has changed. And there is so much fear constantly, continually, in every situation in life. For example, I know that in London again, when I was growing up, I didn't feel that there was any racial barriers. And then there came a moment when there was a massive influx of people of color from Africa. They were coming in because of a political situation in that country, and so it was Asians who came to London, a big number, and people became very afraid. They were afraid of the immigrants, and the immigrants were afraid of them, and it was a general situation that came up. And so there's a lot of fear on both sides, people who perpetrate violence, but also people who are the victims of violence. And that's not a healthy society. If your actions are going to be fear-based, what happened to love? What happened to being able to see my neighbor and loving my neighbor? And so I see that you can't legislate for these things. Most countries do have some sort of anti-discrimination laws in place, but to what extent can you change people's hearts and minds through laws? I don't think you can. But when people begin to understand something, then there's a shift. And I know for myself, having been in situations where there was racial discrimination, I was lucky. I was already on a spiritual path when I was faced with this. And so once I had to face this, I had to ask myself the question, what's going on inside of me? Am I going to react and run, or am I going to leave the country? What am I going to do? And the first thought that came was that, well, I can't expect the other to change. If I wait for others to change, I don't know how long that's going to take. What I can do is come back to the inner being and get in touch with my own inner core values and have respect for myself and have that inner dignity in which no one outside can take that dignity away from me. When I start seeing myself as a spiritual being, then I can identify that whatever it is that's causing the discrimination or the bullying is something that's very external. Color obviously is one thing, gender might be another thing, but in the case of bullying, the other person is seeing me as someone inferior, and so they can oppress me. And the change that happens within the self is that I change my perception of myself. I'm no longer fragile, I'm no longer weak, I'm no longer an employee, but I am an individual filled with all virtues and all treasures, and I come back to that understanding of who I truly am as that inner being. whenever there's a revolution that happens within society, it's never that it starts with a majority. It'll start with 1, 10, 100 enlightened individuals, and that will bring about a transformation. And then at some point of time, the minority view reaches a critical mass and it becomes a view that's now recognized by the majority. That's how the slave trade was abolished. That's how smoking in public places has finished in many countries. So we've had indicators of this. And so here again, if people who are being victimized, who are the target of discrimination, if individuals begin to respond differently, and instead of reacting with anger or sorrow or any other negative response, if they're able to hold their own inner dignity, I think there's a very strong message that's being sent out, and I think situations change. It was like Mandela. He didn't tell the people in South Africa to react with anger. He told people to react with forgiveness. And one man was able to shift the consciousness of a nation and at that time avert the tragedy of a civil war. I was in South Africa a lot in those days, and so I saw the shift happen. And so I'm very convinced that when there's a shift within one individual, it doesn't stay restricted to one. It impacts their family, their community, and it's able to spread out further and further. And so I think that yes, there can be a shift. Am I going to continue to live my life in fear? Fear is something that happens in the mind, but fear is something that also happens in the body. When my body is reacting to the fear that I'm feeling in my mind, it's a very, very unhealthy situation. The whole physiology has changed and it's not very helpful. And there'll always be people who don't want to understand these things. No problem. It's okay. I love them. But there are also people who will want to understand things differently so that their own responses can be different also. I've seen that external change isn't making any difference to how I feel and how I'm responding. And so I ask myself the question, is there a different way to deal with all of this? And then I go on that inner journey of understanding and changing. Yeah. And so I think that really if we want to have a world without discrimination, a world without bullying, then what we have to do is to practice this ourselves, but also share this with our families, our children and others. Come back to the inner dignity of the self and the value of the self. If I begin my day, whatever time my day may begin, for me it begins early in the morning, and that's a very beautiful time when the world is very quiet. But before I begin my day, if I could spend a few minutes, whatever is comfortable for me, whether it's 3 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever, and in those special moments which are for me, sacred moments, what I'm doing is reminding myself of essential spiritual truths, that I am not the physical body, I'm not my designation, I'm not the color of my skin, I'm not all of these labels that people have attached to me. I am a being of light. I am a being of love, of truth, of joy. And as I remind myself of this reality and truth, I begin to feel that way. I begin to experience the reality of that. And that means I'm beginning my day coming out of the right side of bed, in a sense. And once I've started that journey, it can only continue, because I can come back to that feeling of the start of the day again and again. Whenever I have a moment, instead of putting things in my ears and plugging in and hearing all sorts of other things, I'll want to come back to that awareness of my own inner dignity, because it makes me feel good. It's good for me and it makes me feel good, and it's definitely going to bring about change. So the starting point, how can I trust myself when I know myself? And knowing myself happens when I give time to myself. If I'm not willing to give time to myself, how can I know myself and how can I trust myself? So going on that inner journey in silence to know myself, connecting with who I am, learning that I'm a spiritual being, and connecting with the inner being, I see value for myself, respect for myself, trust myself, and I have dignity. And I'm able then to treat others with dignity also. Without my inner self-respect, I cannot treat anyone else with dignity. I see people very, very anxious. I see young people, children, also worried and anxious today. Again, I don't think I'd ever heard of an educational psychologist when I was at school. And today I hear of educational psychologists at schools. So that's telling me a story. And so young and old, everybody seems to be worried and anxious. And again, I see that it's not an external problem. Maybe there's a situation where really there is cause for concern. For example, it may be that I don't have enough money. Maybe it's possible that I've been given a diagnosis of an illness and it could be quite threatening. Or maybe somebody I love very much who's close to me has been given that diagnosis. So there are very real causes for anxiety sometimes. But also, have you noticed that sometimes there are things that are quite stable, quite okay, but there's the habit of worrying. And a person gets anxious when there's really no need to be anxious at all. I'm not even talking about the extreme situations of phobias, because that is something which is a medical issue and can be dealt with separately, but just day-to-day living and worried about this, that and the other. You know, there was a survey done some time ago, and this was by one of the British national papers, daily papers, and they asked people how often was it that the cause of their worry became a reality, and how often was that the cause of their worry really had no basis at all. And they discovered later that there was no basis, they were just worrying. And about 80% of the time, the things that we are worried about actually never happen. So that's also a fact of life. But just thinking about where people really have a cause for anxiety. Maybe I don't have enough money. Is it possible for me to think about money in a different way? And instead of thinking not having enough, I start thinking, well, where is it I can start saving? And probably there are things that I can simplify in my life to a certain extent, maybe not a great extent, a certain extent. Maybe is it possible for me to get a second job? And maybe it's not. I understand that also. But just allowing the mind not to get stuck into just worrying, I can't, what's going to happen, to start thinking a little bit differently, to start moving the mind into a space that's a little bit more creative, so that I allow myself the possibility of hope for the future. Because so often with worry and anxiety comes depression, in which I lose hope for the future. And human life without hope is really no life at all. But if I can shift my thinking and come back to a state in which I can be a little bit more creative, there can be hope. I know, for example, when people have been told about illness, I've seen two reactions. Again, a person lose hope and become very anxious, but other people, and it's not one or two, it's been several individuals that I've seen, and they look at it differently. They look at it as an opportunity to change the course of their life. where they've been busy, 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 and haven't had time for family, haven't had time for the self. Now they discover that it's now possible. They're given permission to be able to shift their lifestyle and make time for the self and family. And once they start doing that, again, the quality of life begins to improve. And of course, again, it's a known medical fact that if you have faith and hope, you're more likely to be able to reverse the illness, whatever it may be. And if you lose hope and say, woe is me, how sad, how bad, who can help you? Even the doctors can't help you. And so my way of thinking, my pattern of thinking is something that I can take charge of, which is something that we've never appreciated usually. We think that, the way I'm thinking is the way I am, and that's how it's always going to be. But spirituality is saying, I am the master of my own mind. I am the master of my own thoughts, and I can move my thoughts from a dark place to a place of light. I can begin to shift my own thinking and make it different. I'm going to say something quite controversial, and I don't mind. I think that, in fact, when you create an external system that you think is going to make life more secure for you or your loved ones, your children, and so on, you're actually inviting violence. I remember a woman in South Africa again during the days of apartheid, and she was a woman of color. She said to me she was given a job in a hotel, and after she'd accepted the job, the hotel manager, at that time in a different colored costume, white, gave her a gun and said to her, you're going to be walking in the streets at late hours because of the work that you're going to do here. You should keep this for your safety. And she looked at him and she said, I think that's actually going to create the violence that I would rather not have. And she refused to take the gun. He was quite surprised, but he, of course, accepted. And she was fine. She was safe. And so somehow the vibration that I generate, in which I think I'm protected, but in fact it's a signal of great fear. And so it's like a very gross example again, but a dog smells your fear. And so he's more likely to attack you than if you send out a vibration of love, and he'll come close to you and there won't be a problem. And so if I'm thinking that this may happen, that may happen, and the other may happen, which many people are at the moment, I'm told that one of the fastest growing businesses is that of security systems. But if I'm doing all of that, my mind is actually trapped in its own fear and may even be generating more violence. There's another way to do it, and that is to know that if I do that which my inner moral compass is telling me is right, then the goodness of that is going to protect me. And if I also know that the power of love can be my protection, then I'm going to allow the inner awareness of love to generate more and more power, so that that power of love can actually protect me. And can you imagine what a life of a child is if the mother is afraid and keeps saying, bolt the door, do this, do that, don't go out, mustn't go here, mustn't go there? It's like caging the child, putting him in a prison. What sort of adult is that child going to become? Not a very healthy person. And so I think that inner peace, inner sanctuary, that inner protection of goodness and love is the strength that we can all tap into. And that truly is going to be the protection in which I really don't need to be afraid. I don't need to worry about what the future holds. the future totally depends on my present and what's going on at this present moment. A relationship is meant to be one in which there's an exchange of happiness and love, and instead of that, it's become a source of tremendous sorrow and conflict sometimes. And I feel that it's because we have wrong expectations. We expect something from the other to come to me, and that's going to fulfill me and satisfy me. And another person can give me something, some of the time, but not everything all of the time. And yet that's our expectation of others. But of course, their expectation of me is similar. And so it's like, imagine a string, and a string being pulled in two directions, it's going to snap. And so today we find that relationships are very short-lived. Even parent and children relationships, one would imagine that that could last a lifetime. But within that also, there are so many problems that arise. And so I see that it's a question of expectation and lack of fulfillment that's causing us deep, deep sorrow. I think the only answer to this whole story of broken promises and relationships is finding a way to be able to become complete within myself, so that I don't have that void inside that makes me think that you or anyone else is responsible for filling that space within. I have to find a way, and believe it, that I can be fulfilled and complete as my own being without somebody else being needed to complement me or to fill in those empty gaps. And so spirituality, as far as I can see, is actually the only answer that can allow me to come to that inner state of fulfillment and be content with that. And that then makes a very powerful shift, because now, instead of approaching the other in that consciousness of wanting something from them, I am full, I am complete. And maybe now I'm even ready to offer something to them. And so it changes everything completely. And so a person who's lost hope for themselves, they've lost touch with the inner peace that belongs to them originally, a moment of stillness, a few minutes of stillness, and they're able to rediscover the inner beauty of the soul. They're able to experience the treasures that they carry within themselves, even if it's for a moment, but that's enough to restore faith in the self. And so they're able to start that journey in which now the dependency that they had or the possessiveness that they had, they're able to let go of that. And as the relationship sweetens as a result of that, they begin to understand that that's the journey that they need to continue with. I want to start from not just hopelessness, but just the whole subject of anger. And I remember a situation in which I used to feel helpless and I used to cry, but then there came a moment when I actually felt anger, which was, the helplessness was part of it, but then it was an actual very strong manifestation of anger. And it caused a very deep reaction of burden within myself, because I could see that I had caused a lot of sorrow for another. And at that moment, I decided that I mustn't allow this reaction to carry on. And I began to work on myself, seeing the impact that my anger had on another, and how difficult it was to continue in that relationship because of my anger. And I knew that I had to make a shift. And so I started working on myself, and rather than reacting, first step was just to stop the external reaction and connect with the inner peace that I know I have within. But the second step was that it mustn't just be stopping the external reaction, because that's suppression. actually can lead to depression also. And so I had to change my way of thinking. And instead of thinking that I am right, I had to start thinking, well, this is also right, this is also right, and this is also right. And so my horizon shifted, and I could see that there could be many, many different perspectives of the same story, and anger was being resolved very gradually. When I get to the point where I feel helpless, I feel circumstances are out of control, other people are making decisions for my life, things are going in a way that I'm not comfortable at all, then there's an anger that comes up and a rejection of society and people around me. I feel I've been rejected, and so now I'm going to lash out. And this is something that's been studied by sociologists, of course, that young people, for example, where they feel that there isn't an opportunity or a voice being given to them, then they turn to gangs, and the horror and the anger that comes out at that moment is also not very pleasant. And so how do you deal with all of this? Again, it's not by laws, but when a person decides that they want to do something about their own future, and they're not going to wait for somebody else to try and sort things out for them, when that moment comes when I feel, let me do something about myself, I tap into my own inner reserves, and I find that inner power and inner strength with which to shift the things in my life. And so I make a difference to myself rather than waiting for legislation or policy or social agencies to try and do something. This self-empowerment happens maybe when I'm going through that dark night. And in that darkest hour, I ask, well, who can help me? And I realize that I can help myself. And in that moment, I rediscover that inner peace that is within, the power that I carry within myself. And I also come to realize that anger doesn't actually change a situation. Anger causes more problems to come rather than resolve problems. And so I realize that if I want to make a difference to my life, I have to make a difference to myself. It's become a habit to react. And every time I react, that particular pattern of behavior is reinforced, and it gets stronger and stronger, which is what I was sharing, that I'd seen myself getting more and more angry, and then it reached that tipping point where I didn't want it to carry on anymore. And so if instead of reacting and creating problems for myself, I can just take a moment. There's that moment that happens within our own awareness in which I know I can go this way or I can go this way. Maybe a child has been naughty, and in that moment I know I can either get very angry or I can stay calm and sit the child down and talk quietly and calmly with respect. Now, what's going to make the difference? And that's, in a sense, a simple situation in which it's pretty clear, but there is that moment in which I do have a choice. And if I decide that I'm going to take the path of peace and non-violence, it'll become easier and easier to do that, and I'll begin to see very good results from that, rather than allowing myself to react and dig a deeper and deeper hole for myself in which it's going to be impossible to come out. When there's anger, there's actually no possibility of changing the situation, and things get worse and worse. And I'm talking about countries, not just my personal situation. In a personal situation, the same principle applies. Getting angry about whatever it is that's wrong never removes the injustice. Things just get more complicated and worse. And two wrongs don't actually make a right. That's also pretty clear. And in a country situation, think about Mahatma Gandhi and how if he had reacted with violence, there's no way that there could have been victory. And India would still be, maybe, in the condition it was 50, 70 years ago. But he decided to follow a different path. And that path, being so different, had within it spiritual power. The power of non-violence was such that it was able to have victory. The power of forgiveness in Nelson Mandela. And again, it was able to shift the whole scene completely. So history actually has shown us examples of how when you're using the power of peace and the power of non-violence, things make a difference. And if you'd continue to have a war and another war and another war, well, we'd still be fighting. When I look at the state of the world and I see the tremendous amount of sorrow and suffering, then I ask myself the question, is there something I can do, not just to help myself, but to take away the pain and sorrow of others? And what comes to mind is the fact that if people could get a glimpse of the spiritual dimension and understand that there's different ways to deal with the situation of the world than we've been doing in the last little while, if a group here, a group here, a group here begin to look at things differently and start making changes in their lives, then I think that the pain and sorrow of the world could be relieved. And that would give me great contentment. So my hope is that people find that light that's going to help them shift their understanding and perception and what it is they do.